A public debt is a public curse. That's how James Madison put it, and he was right. Today, America is absolutely drowning in a national debt, teetering on the brink. We just hit a new, what probably a few years ago would have been considered an unthinkable milestone, a national debt of $35 trillion and growing very, very fast. So today on this episode, I've got a bunch of warnings about, just excessive spending and relentless perpetual debt from the founders, both Federalist and Anti-Federalist alike. And as long as the people keep ignoring them, this public curse is just going to keep getting worse. All right, I guess I should do a rhyme every time now. But anyways, first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center. This is the show for Wednesday, July 31st, 2024. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me. But let's kick this off here from fiscal data, treasury.gov on July 26th, just a few days ago. The national debt blew past $35 trillion for the first time. We were cursed with a debt of, what's that number? 35,001,278,179,208 and 67 cents. But it's going really, really fast. It's ramping up. And Mike Meharry puts it this way in a new article we just published. He said, it's hard to even fathom this much debt. To put it into perspective, every American citizen, every single one would have to write a check for $103,834 to pay it off. And we know most of us don't have that kind of loot sitting around. And then if we limit the funding to just taxpayers, Mike points out, your share would be $267,404. Mike also writes for another great website, Money Metals, the moneymetals.com blog, and he puts it this way there. To put it another way, $35 trillion is more than the total economies of China, Japan, Germany, and the UK combined, the largest government in history with the biggest debt in history. This is not going to end well. John Adams warned of this type of thing here in a letter to Abigail Adams in 1794. He said, I lament the introduction of taxes and expenses which will accumulate a perpetual debt and lead to future revolutions. And in essence, even if we haven't had what most people think of as a revolution, we certainly had a revolution against the original Constitution. They keep taking on this debt. They keep spending. They keep expanding into new programs. It's a revolution of centralized power against the system created by the founding generation. Now, Thomas Jefferson felt that running a perpetual debt was intentional. So John Adams, on the one side, thought having a perpetual one would lead towards a revolution. And Jefferson thought that revolution, he didn't use that term, but was intentional in order to lead towards a monarchy. And here's how he put it in a letter to George Washington. He said that the ultimate object of all this is to prepare the way for a change from the present republican form of government to that of a monarchy, of which the English Constitution is to be the model. He said that this was contemplated in the convention in Philadelphia is no secret. Jefferson wasn't there. He was in France, and a lot of people, especially on the right, they try to diminish him as if he had no influence. We don't have to pay attention to him. He doesn't count because he wasn't in Philadelphia. But certainly Jefferson was aware of what was going on. A lot of people were communicating with him. There were some debates in various state ratifying conventions to prove that they were on the Jeffersonian side. But that's a side note. He recognized that people like Alexander Hamilton specifically wanted to do away with a republican form of government and create a centralized, all-powerful system that was very much similar to a monarchy. And Jefferson here thought that the relentless perpetual debt was a big part of that. Here's John Taylor of Caroline a number of years later. He said, debt, so far from being either strength or credit, is a diminution of both. So many people today, especially in the political realm, they talk about having to have strong national security. We have to protect you. We're going to keep you safe. While on the other hand, they sit there spending and taxing so much that they're actually destroying national security. That's the view of John Taylor. We'll also get to George Washington on that in a moment. Strength and credit are destroyed by debt. And that freedom from debt, he writes, is the only genuine source of national strength depending on revenue. So your country is strong. It's able to defend itself. It will grow in influence and prosperity and freedom if you don't have a bunch of debt run up by government. Now, George Washington also directly linked good credit with national strength. And here's how he put it in his farewell address. He said, as a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible. Now, if it isn't obvious that this is one of the things that has been almost 100% ignored very quickly and to just absolutely destructive ends, I don't know what to do to help you, but I just wanted to point this out. Anyways, Washington and others, they didn't think that you couldn't ever take on debt. Even Jefferson, who wanted to reduce the debt at all times, worked with Albert Gallatin to do so while he was in office. It was just that creating an environment of perpetual debt is a way that you manipulate the system and you grow centralized power. And then when you actually need an extra boost to go beyond what your regular expenses are, the well runs dry. And it's a very dangerous situation, especially when you need to defend yourself. Now, so they just recognized that it needed to be used only when necessary, but paying it off quickly was absolutely essential. And here's how George Washington put it. He said, one method of preserving it, the public credit, is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace. So when we think of peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, for example, we think about our true policy is to steer clear of any permanent alliance with the foreign world. We think of these messages from people like Jefferson and Washington and others. They recognize that you're strong by cultivating peace because then you don't have to take on a bunch of debt as well or have permanent standing armies. Washington continued. He said, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it. So be smart about how you spend. Don't waste a bunch of money. Stay within the bounds of the Constitution was George Washington's message. But use it very sparingly because it's dangerous to national security to have a massive national debt. He also said, avoid likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertions in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. The idea that you have to defend yourself and take on a bunch of debt to do so, this was not something that the founding generation was opposed to. They just didn't want you to have a perpetual, well, not everybody was on board with the message that I'm sharing. I'll get to that in a moment as well. But the notion here that Washington is telling us is, we should be able to take care of ourselves. And if we have to do something very difficult, it's not really a good moral choice to throw that on to future generations. Throw it onto your children and your grandchildren and beyond. So the TLDR on that is don't spend a ton so you have the ability to take on the debt that you need when you need it and then pay it off quickly because that's how you have a good free society. Washington continued this message. Of course, he had this off and on throughout his 2 terms in office. Here he is in his 5th annual message to Congress in December of 1793. He said, no pecuniary consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. On none can delay be more injurious or an economy of time more valuable. So delaying paying off the public debt is incredibly injurious to the country. That's how George Washington put it. And of course, he's been totally ignored, especially in modern times. Here's the last of the, I guess we'll call them the Virginians. James Monroe, in his first inaugural address in 1817, he said the great amount, he really wanted to cut the spending and the debt, and he worked very hard on that as well. He said the great amount of our revenue and the flourishing state of the Treasury are a full proof of the competency of the national resources for any emergency, as they are of the willingness of our federal citizens to bear the burdens which the public necessities require. He said these resources, talking about vacant lands, we could sell stuff off if we need to, of course. These resources, besides accomplishing every other necessary purpose, put it completely in the power of the United States to discharge the national debt at an early period. So his first inaugural address, one of the big things that he's talking about is how quickly can we get the debt down? And he certainly did succeed on that to some level. So did Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, surprisingly enough, as well. Now, all of these original source documents, plus Mike Maharry's fun article on well, it's not fun, it's really bad news, but he has an interesting approach to it as well, interspersed with some of the quotes that I'm using here as well. All this will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Over the next couple of hours, as we do after every single episode, my buddy Alan Mosley does an awesome job of organizing a blog post for each episode, and I'll get it published a couple of hours later today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And there, you're going to find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like X and LinkedIn and YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and all over the place. We also live stream on some other platforms like Odyssey.com and Rumble.com. We archive the video version everywhere possible, Brighteon and BitChute, etc. Minds.com. We have the audio-only podcast edition on every platform we can think of getting into our workflow. But if we're missing from one, you can definitely let me know, whether in the comments or an email, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, because we want to be on the platforms where you are so we can reach as many people as possible. But we'll publish that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And the important point is there's a show link section, because what I'm discussing here in this episode, 20 to 40 minutes, however long I blab for, I'm just scratching the surface, and it's important if you want to learn more to have the resources that I'm citing from so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. That'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the chat. There's a Six Dive and Brewster and Dennis and Gypsy over on rumble.com. I appreciate you guys being there. The community is growing and pretty awesome. Howard and Kirk and Hippie and Haji and Rights Are Not Tradition and Jug. Jug, I got a message that I got to get back to you. I appreciate you reaching out. We'll touch base with you as soon as I'm able to. Elsa and a few other people. I know I'm missing a few, but I wanted to say thank you again for being here and remind you 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty is where the show notes are going to be for this episode, like every episode. So let's get back to this. We've discussed some of the views of the founding generation. Don't take on too much debt so you can. Don't take it on continually. Just take it on when you need to. Keep your spending within the realms of your revenues and pay off debt as it goes so you can take on the amount needed in a serious emergency. Now, of course, whether it was Washington or Monroe or Jefferson or even John Adams, they weren't the only view. There's other people who thought a perpetual debt was probably a good thing. Alexander Hamilton, for example. Here he is all the way back in 1781 in a letter to Robert Morris. He said, "A national debt, if not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be a powerful cement of our union." Now, there is the caveat, of course. Hamilton is saying, if not excessive. But he did want to have a perpetual debt. People like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Washington, and others that I've been citing here, that while they were okay with a debt that wasn't excessive, they didn't want it to be perpetual, because perpetual, as Jefferson described earlier, and what he'll get to a little bit more, is really a tool to expand centralized power. So maybe this is nice sounding, maybe this is legitimate from Hamilton, but certainly this term public blessing, if you were to do some research over at the National Archives or Consource or various other places, Liberty Fund, and look for things discussing debt as a blessing, there's a lot of commentary. Some of those out there think this kind of thing is a blessing, and you'll see this from time to time as well. This actually kind of got into the psyche that the Hamiltonians thought debt was a good thing. But I want to just make sure that everyone's aware. He certainly is saying, if not excessive. I don't know what his line in the sand was, but he certainly thought there was one. He said, but here's the interesting part, and I think this is where Jefferson is grasping what it's being used for. He said, it will also create a necessity for keeping up taxation to a degree which, without being oppressive, will be a spur to industry. So Hamilton was of the belief that the more taxation you have, as long as it isn't too high, again, another gray area, you have to have more taxation in order to have more prosperity. When really, if those of us who believe in liberty and understand the benefits of liberty, it's the opposite. So Hamilton, the national debt was a tool to perpetuate taxation as theft. Anyways, here he is. Even Hamilton, again, if you can trust him, here he is in his report of January 1790 under the Washington administration. Persuaded as the secretary is that the proper funding of the present debt will render it a national blessing. In other words, don't get it too high and then continually throw more money at it, have the taxation going, just like he was saying to Morris some years earlier. Again, still a national blessing. Yet he is so far from acceding to the position in the latitude in which it is sometimes laid down that public debts are public benefits. And so he's actually rejecting that view, but kind of. I think in practice, not really. He said that is a position inviting to prodigality, and liable to dangerous abuse, that he ardently wishes to see it incorporated as a fundamental maxim in this system of public credit of the United States, that the creation of debt should always be accompanied with the means of extinguishment. But if you're always taking on more debt and you're using it as a tool to create more taxation, that really does mean a system of perpetual debt. Hamilton just wanted it to be at a certain level. Now, James Madison, here he is writing The Union, Who Are Its Real Friends? That was the title of his essay in March 1792. He said, the real friends to the Union are those, and I should actually do a short episode just covering his take here, but the real friends to the Union are those, and here's one that he includes, who, considering a public debt as injurious to the interests of the people and baneful to the virtue of government, are enemies to every contrivance for unnecessarily increasing its amount or protracting its duration or extending its influence. Madison, again, he really highlighted unnecessarily increasing, acknowledging that he was on board with taking on a national debt, but he just didn't want it to be ongoing like the Hamiltonian view. So even if he sounds reasonable, of course, if you're going to take on debt, you have a plan to pay it off. But that's not how people like Madison, Jefferson, and Washington saw things. They saw perpetual as a tool to manipulate things. And that's how Jefferson described it in another letter to George Washington in 1792. He said, this exactly marks the difference between Colonel Hamilton's views and mine. Colonel Hamilton's views and mine, sorry about that I would wish the debt paid tomorrow. He wishes it never to be paid, but always to be a thing wherewith to corrupt and manage the legislature. Now, I see two big roadblocks to ever paying off the debt, other than the fact that so many people don't pay attention to it. They don't think it's an issue. Oh, everything's fine. Well, I'm not going to do anything until the world crumbles around me, and that's not going to happen. They're keeping us safe. But first, the biggest roadblock is spending too much. Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it in a letter to John Taylor, 1816. The principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. And if you think about that mentality in comparison to what George Washington had to say in his farewell address, this is not something we should send to future generations. It should be our burden to bear. If you take on your own debt, each generation should pay its debt as it goes. Jefferson thought that would reduce at least half the wars that the world had ever seen if people just paid off their debt. So spending too much is a serious problem. It's also a serious ripoff. Here's John Adams in his first annual message to Congress, 1797. He said, the consequences arising from the continual accumulation of public debts in other countries ought to admonish us to be careful to prevent their growth in our own. The national defense must be provided for, as well as the support of government, but should be accomplished as much as possible by immediate taxes and as little as possible by loans. Now, that wasn't a real hardcore position against perpetual debt, but it certainly is a warning. It is a warning against its increasing, at least. I would take the Adams view over what we have today, although I think the argument against it would be, well, if you don't get rid of it, someone else is going to come in and expand it. Once they have that power, someone else is always going to use it. But anyways, Adams basically took the view that spending more than they take in is not a good approach. Now, unfortunately, we're nowhere remotely close to even the average average, grading it on a curve, maybe Adams gets a C or a D, something like that. But we're not even remotely close to that kind of a standard today. And here's how Meharry put it. He said, through 8 months of fiscal 2024, just 8 months, the federal government has spent a staggering $5 trillion. That's up 8% over the same period last year. And there is no spending in sight. Now, he actually pointed out in this article, he's like, man, I feel like I just wrote an article about this. Oh, he said, yeah. I said, I feel like I just wrote an article about the debt crossing the 34 trillion mark. That's because I did. On January 4th, it only took the government 7 months to add another $1 trillion. And that's going to keep growing and growing and getting faster and faster. For, years ago, we'd say, oh, what, adding $1 trillion? That's insane. That's going to take quite a long time. Now it's $1 trillion in less than a year. Eventually, at this pace, it's going to be a few trillion per year, and it is totally out of control. Here's Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Samuel Kercheval, 1816 as well, depending on, you might be another name, seeing how you list it, but we'll get it linked to in the show notes. He said, if we run into such debts as that we must be taxed in our meat and in our drink, in our necessities and our comforts, in our labors and our amusements, for our callings and our creeds, as the people of England are, our people like them must come to labor 16 hours in the 24, give the earnings of the 15 of these to the government for their debts and daily expenses. And then on top of it, the 16th being insufficient to afford us bread, we must live as they now do on oatmeal and potatoes, have no time to think, no means of calling the mismanagers to account. One of the ways that they use crushing debt to destroy liberty and expand their power is it destroys the ability, the time that people have, the willingness to be able to spend time keeping the people in power in check. And Jefferson recognized this in 1816. If you have to work so hard because the prices keep going up through their inflationary monetary policies, well, that takes up more of our time. And really, what do we want to do with our time? We want to spend our time with our family, our friends. We want to relax. We want to, work on hobbies. We don't want to have to be fighting against a government power. And government people know this. This is one of the great ways they've always kept populations on their knees. Anyways, he said, we can no means of calling the mismanagers to account, but be glad to obtain subsistence by hiring ourselves to rivet their chains on the necks of our fellow sufferers. Jefferson, very prophetic there. Sounds pretty familiar to what we live under today. Now, here's James Madison with that quote that I put right at the beginning. This is in a letter to Henry Lee in 1790. I go on the principle that a public debt is a public curse, and in a Republican government, a greater curse than in any other. Once the people, I forget who said this one, someone in the chat will know or in the comments, once the people learn that they can vote themselves the public wealth, they're going to never, ever stop doing that. And that's my paraphrase. Now, the second thing that gets in the way, of course, this massive spending is a huge problem. No one seems to want to talk about cutting it back. It's just about which social programs are going to get the priority. But the other thing that's a big issue, as Mike Meharry points out, is once you have a massive debt, you also develop a problem with interest payments on that debt. And Mike writes that politicians and pundits will keep kicking the debt can down the road as long as they can. But that road is getting shorter. Interest on the debt is overwhelming the federal budget. At some point, it'll be number one. The federal government, he said, spent $140.2 billion paying just the interest on the national debt in the month of June alone. That was just over 30% of the month's total tax receipts. So the amount of money that they're stealing from us to do all kinds of unconstitutional programs to fund those, or at least give the appearance that we're funding it, is 30% of it is just for the interest on the debt that they're taking out to do all kinds of stuff that they were never authorized to do in the first place. Going forward, he says, so far this year, the federal government has spent more on interest than it has on national defense. That's $644 billion. Medicare, $629. The only spending category bigger than interest is Social Security. So in fiscal 2024, they've spent $868 billion just on interest, more than defense and Medicare. And we can understand why throwing all that money into that is a serious national security issue, just like John Taylor said, just like George Washington said, and there were many others as well. So this interest problem was not something that was, ignored during the ratification debates. Here's Francis Corbett, for example, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. Borrow money to discharge the interest of what was borrowed and continually augment the public debt? Such a plan would destroy the richest country on earth. He knew it. We're seeing it kind of start to unfold before our very eyes. And the anti-federalist writer Brutus, in his 8th paper, discussed what he saw as parts of the Constitution which would lead towards all kinds of relentless, expanding, perpetual debt. He said the power to borrow money is general and unlimited. Now, of course, I think he recognized, and we can see from his writing, he recognized that even if you could describe it as not being that, he expected it to play out this way. That's my take on it. He said, under this authority, the Congress may mortgage any or all the revenues of the Union as a fund to loan money upon, and it is probably in this way they may borrow of foreign nations a principal sum, the interest of which will be equal to the annual revenues of this country. He warned in January of 1788, Brutus, we don't know for sure who it was, maybe John Williams of New York, we don't know. He's warning in January of 1788 that eventually we're going to have just an interest payment that costs the entire revenue. Now, if we're at 30% of just June alone, we're on that path, and it can get much, much worse. He said, by this means, they may create a national debt so large as to exceed the ability of the country ever to sink. And he continued with this warning, a doomsday warning. I can scarcely contemplate a greater calamity that could befall this country than to be loaded with a debt exceeding their ability ever to discharge. Now, if we're not already there, we are so close. And that's why we feel it's so important to get this kind of warning, this information from the founders, the old revolutionaries, out to more and more people. And there is absolutely nothing that helps us do this work, roll up our sleeves every single day and get the job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. And every penny of that quickly depreciating garbage, well, we use it to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government likes it or not. They certainly don't. We punch way above our weight class, and I appreciate your support. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say a huge thank you, but very quickly, to a handful of people who have joined us as members lately. I don't have the full list in front of me, but here's a handful that I picked out at random. There's Mona in Florida. Thank you. Ricardo in Texas. Matthew in New Hampshire, Alice in Pennsylvania, and Troy here in California. Also, William in Arizona. Thank you all very much for putting your financial faith behind our work. Again, if you want to support us as well, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I see a number of comments and questions coming back and forth from Hippie and Wrights and Kirk and a few others. Benjamin Franklin. Oh, that's the one. Hippie points out it was Benjamin Franklin. I'm not sure. If you got a link for that comment, he said, when the people find that they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic. I mean, whether that's the exact quote or not, I don't know, but I appreciate you sharing that. I'm definitely going to look that one up as well this afternoon. I appreciate it. That's an important one. And whether it was Franklin or somebody else, a lot of times people say, well, don't read someone posting a quote in the comments because a lot of times they cite the wrong thing or the quote's wrong. What I think is most important is the message. And is that message true? I think absolutely, and we see it playing out before our very eyes. I'll get back to some more of the comments and questions. I'll read through them a little bit later today or tomorrow. I read through virtually all of them. I don't get a chance to reply to many, but I appreciate your support and taking actions like leaving comments or reviews on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button, subscribing, getting notifications. All those things can help trigger the algorithms of these mainstream platforms, and it tells them to show us to more people, and we're reaching more and more people than I ever imagined when I first kicked off this organization back in 2006. So 18 years strong, and we're growing thanks to your support. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.